Welcome to our tutorial on building a cooperative game using Java. In this series, we are going to take you step by step through the entire process of creating a simple cooperative game, where players will have to work together to achieve a common goal. So why cooperative games? These games encourage teamwork, strategy, and communication among players, making them an exciting genre in gaming. Let's get started. Before we dive into the code, let's first outline what we want our game to be. For this tutorial, we'll create a simple cooperative game where players must gather resources while avoiding obstacles. The game will feature a grid-based map, players represented as characters, and collectible resources. We will use Java's Swing library for the graphical user interface. Now that we have a concept, let's set up our project structure. Create a new Java project in your favorite IDE. We will structure it as follows. src com.example.cooperative game, main.java, gamepanel.java, player.java, resource.java, gameobject.java, gameconstants.java, gamelogic.java. Next, let's create the gameconstants class to define some constants that we will use throughout our game. This will help us keep things organized and easy to manage. In this gameconstants class, we've defined the size of our grid, the size of each grid cell, and the number of resources that will be generated in the game. Now, let's move on to the GameObject class, which will be the base for our players and resources. The GameObject class defines the position and color properties for our game objects and includes an abstract method for drawing the object on the screen. Now let's implement the player class, which extends the GameObject. In our player class, we are providing an implementation for the draw method that draws the player as a rectangle on the grid based on their current position. Now it's time to add the resource class, which will also extend GameObject. The resource class represents the resources that players can collect. We will represent them as yellow circles on the grid as indicated in the draw method. Now let's implement the GameLogic class, which will manage the game state, including players and resources. The GameLogic class maintains lists of players and resources. It will also have methods for updating the game state and setting up the initial game conditions. Now let's implement the setup game method to initialize our players and resources. With our setup method, we're adding one player at the top left corner of the grid and randomly placing the resources. Very nice. Now it's time to implement the GamePanel class to create the game interface. This is where we'll set up our main drawing area. In the GamePanel class, we're overriding the paint component method, where we'll draw our players and resources using the drawGame method. We've instantiated the GameLogic class to manage the game state in the background. Next, let's implement the main class to start our game application. In the main class, we set up our JFrame, configure it with the title we defined in GameConstants, and add our game panel. This sets the stage for our game. Now let's run our application to see what we have built so far. Great! We now have a window displaying our player and a number of resources in random positions. Before we conclude this video, let's add some interaction features so that players can move around the grid and collect resources. To handle input, we can implement KeyListener in the GamePanel class. Let's modify the GamePanel class to respond to key presses to allow player movement. Here we've added a KeyListener to capture keyboard inputs for moving the player. Each arrow key will move the player up, down, left, or right on the grid. Now that we've modified our GamePanel class, we also need to add an ability to move the player in the player class. In the player class, we added methods to move the player's position, ensuring the player can't move outside of the grid boundaries. Lastly, let's enable resource collection. In the player class, we've added a method to collect resources. Players will collect a resource when they move to the same grid position as a resource. To call this method, we can hook it into our movePlayer method in the GamePanel class. Now when the player moves, they will collect any resources present in their new position. Let's run the game again to ensure everything works well. Fantastic! Players can now move and collect resources. As a recap, we created a grid-based cooperative game in Java using Swing. We implemented movement, resource collection, and basic game management functionalities. Remember that this is just the beginning, and you can expand on this foundation by adding features such as more players, varied resource types, and even obstacles. Thank you for joining us in this tutorial.